We might. I've been trying to figure out the logistics of simply moving into the dining room. But there's a lot of foot traffic on certain days in there and all that. Yeah. So that it is, but then we want different setups, right? We might just move into the nursery so y'all can play with the toys while I'm talking. I'm just kidding. No, that's okay. That's okay. All right, everybody turned over. I mean, it's on the screen, right? So we're in the middle of this story. Priscilla tells me we got to verse 14. You remember the story of Athaliah. So we switch back and forth in 2 Kings between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, the northern kings and the southern kings. We just finished a record of the northern kingdom in which Jehu did a lot of good things, right? He got rid of the Baal worship, but he did not get rid of the blight of the golden calf worship that Jeroboam had started. And you remember Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, is credited with the entire situation for the northern kingdom all the way from the beginning. I mean, he is responsible for it. I mean, he was the first king of the divided kingdom in the northern kingdom. So Jehu does that. Jehu gets blessed. He said, "You're because of your righteousness, your descendants will sit on the throne of the northern kingdom for 4 generations." Right, 4 generations. And so we need to understand, remind ourselves of two things right now, and that is that the northern kingdom, even in its apostasy, even though no one has gotten rid of the blight of the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, God still considers them his people, and he blesses kings for ruling them righteously with multi-generational blessings, right? And that's something you need to take away from that there is really this is generational apostasy to allow Jeroboam, the son of Nebat's golden calf worship to persist among God's people. So it does not replace the Davidic covenant, but it is a good promise, right, that these kings have. And every single king of the northern kingdom has had a good promise from God if they rule righteously, because they're ruling over God's people. And God desires to bless his people and to bring them to repentance, all of those things, right? So the executive office in the nation is important for that. So now we're switching to Judah, right? To demonstrate the difference, right? This is the line of Judah. This is the monarchy that brings the Messiah, right, in Judah. And they're not free from troubles when they choose to act unrighteously, right? So Athaliah hears that going back to verse 1, the mother of Ahaziah saw that her son was dead. She rose and destroyed all the royal offspring. So there are two things we want to remember, just as a review. There is no provision for a queen in Israel. There is less warrant for a queen in Israel than there is for the women pastors all over the place here in El Paso. But with similar problems. This is not what God has decided to rule over his people. It is not what God has determined to pastor the local churches. And you should expect negative consequences for it when it happens. She kills everybody. These are her family members, but she wants to consolidate power. She misses one. And we don't find out a little bit later how little he is. He is an infant, right? It's awfully hard. Anybody tried to take a 3-year-old to a movie theater? Worse, the symphony or something, right? Or something where you actually are expected to, be quiet and not throw popcorn. Like he's littler than a toddler, right? He's an infant. We find out that he becomes king when he is 7. So he is an infant. He's hidden for 6 years, right? This is Jehoash, or Joash, he gets called when he dies, at least as far as the record goes. And so he was hidden, righteously so, right? And we talked about that there are multiple precedents in the history of Israel for this being necessary. Generally speaking, though, like in the case of Moses, they're being hidden from wicked people from other nations. In this case, being hidden from his relative and the queen of Judah, supposedly the queen of Judah, right? We shouldn't call her that. She's a usurper at multiple different levels. And so after 6 years, they decide, sure, after 6 years, round numbers, probably under 1 at least. And when he's 7 years old, they decide that, he's ready to be king. Easy peasy, right? He's a very mature 7-year-old. I'm sure that he had a lot of, regents, advisors, and we find out that he was very much cared for by a priest, which is a connection that we lose, right? We have priests and prophets coming, having to confront kings over and over, serving as prophets. But there was supposed to be a very, very close discipleship relationship between the Levitical priesthood and those who would be king, right? We find that when a king is anointed under the Mosaic law, Moses predicted a king generations before they had one, right? When you anointed a king, when you do so, against all advice, against all of what God says is going to happen, when you really don't like your children that much, and you really don't like your daughters that much, and you want them to all be taken by the king, and you want all this to happen, at least make sure that king sits before the Levitical priest and writes out his own copy of the law, so that he is careful to do what it says and to rule accordingly. And I've mentioned before, I don't see that ever recorded, that ever happened. And we ask why there are troubles in the monarchies of either kingdom. But it's good, right, for the priesthood to take some care and concern for the nature of the king, rather than just waiting for them to need to be rebuked, right? So we have Jehoiada here, the priest who does that. He's also, get this, spears and shields and King David's who were stored in the house of Yahweh. I like it that they had an armory, right? The Vatican has the right idea here. They have an armory. That's their kingdom theology, though, that drives it, and that wouldn't be why we do it. We just have one because it's cool, right? You carry it on your hip, I hope. All right. Anyway, it's not averse to God's will to have an armory in the house of Yahweh. You kind of need it sometimes, right? So they stood, and they crowned the boy king. He didn't actually have a name yet. I don't think his name has been mentioned to this point. I gave it to you because it doesn't make sense without giving the name and the age, right? Oh, there we go. All right. Okay. So he brought the king's son out and put the crown on him, gave him the testimony. You Pentecostals are going to run with that one, right? That's all they did was say, God has willed this guy as king. They're not speaking in tongues and dancing around and barking like a dog. They gave him the testimony, right? Right. They just pointed him out as the king. This is the guy. They anoint him. They commission him, right? That's the job. Anoint him. They clapped their hands and said, long live the king, because nobody wants a 7-year-old to die, right? Long live the king. It's a dangerous place, though, for a kid to be. So when Athaliah heard this noise of the garden of all the people, she came to the people and the house of Yahweh. She looked, and behold, the king was standing by the pillar according to the custom. Y'all know the custom. No need to mention what it is. The custom. It was the custom. This is what they always did. Well, the captains and the trumpeters beside the king and all the people of the land rejoiced and blew trumpets. And then Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, treason! Treason! Sounds familiar, doesn't it? All the people committing treason in the whole country are sitting around the loudest, screaming treason, treason. Yeah. Right? I won't go into the details, but there are lots of pejoratives out there that are used most loudly by the people for whom they apply. Does that make sense? If you hear somebody standing on the street corner, or like the guy in Sam's a few months ago that screamed bloody murder in the aisle at me that I was a racist because I was 3 inches across the middle line with my cart, that man's a racist. How do I know that? Because he was screaming at the top of his lungs down an aisle in the middle of Sam's Club like an absolute nutter, screaming racist at me. I was concealed carrying at the time. He probably would have kept his mouth shut if I was in full church mode. Anyway, treason, racist, bigot, whatever, phobic. Anybody getting tired of being called phobic for lots of things? Yeah, phobic. Something. And Jehoiada the priest commanded the captains of the hundreds who were appointed over the army and said to them, bring her out between the ranks, and whoever follows her put to death with the sword. For the priest said, let her not be put to death in the house of Yahweh. You ever wonder where the principle comes? You ever wonder in the Westerns, right, where the whole gang of bad guys goes and tries to cram themselves into a little mud brick chapel because it was supposed to be a sanctuary, and then the real good guys shoot them anyway, right? They don't pay attention to that crap. Well, the theory came from that, right? The theory, and it's still pervasive, that the priest at least did not want, and this is the issue, they don't care if bad guys get justice in the house of Yahweh, but they wouldn't want human blood to be spilled and contaminate, or animal blood. That would be akin to an abomination of desolation. Like we talk about that in terms of a pig being sacrificed, but human sacrifice, human blood would have been a far greater defilement, right? So it's not just that it was a sanctuary, right, where you couldn't get shot. There was a theological reason in the house of Yahweh why you wouldn't want human blood to be spilt. You executed people outside the camp. You took the criminals outside the camp to do it. That's why Gehenna is the place where the fire does not die and the worm is not quenched, and not the temple, right? You don't stink it up like that or defile it. Anyway, that's what when people get upset, then they tell me that the church is a house of peace, right? Well, it's not the house of Yahweh, for one thing. Don't make that mistake. It's the house of El Paso Bible Church. And in the house of El Paso Bible Church, we keep the peace, right? That's what we do. We keep the peace because we say things that people get shot for all the time. And I intend to shoot them back unless it's a clear case of persecution for believing in Jesus rather than you don't like my male girlfriend furry or something like that, right? Reference some current events. All right. So Jehoiada made a covenant between Yahweh and the king and the people that they would be the Yahweh's people, and also between the king and the people. Why was that necessary? Does that terminology bother you? Made a covenant? What are they doing? Yeah, they're reasserting its application and their devotion to it. It's the Mosaic covenant, not the Abrahamic covenant, right? You don't renew something or reaffirm your adherence to something that has no conditions. Does that make sense? In other words, the Abrahamic covenant has no conditions. Land, seed, blessing forever, ultimately. Moses says all the blessings, all the curses, and after all of that is done, then the Lord will bring the fullness of his covenant upon you. Land, seed, blessing forever. Be ruled by the Davidic king in the kingdom, and it will be forever. You don't have to renew that. You don't have to refresh it. You should review it. Everybody should know it. Y'all should know it because it makes sense of the world as we know it today in ways that nothing else can. But they're not doing that. They're saying the Mosaic covenant has statutes like tear down the high places, don't permit Baal worship, reestablish the feast observance, get, all of those things. And they're saying that they're renewing that in this generation, right? This generation is such that they're renewing it. The priest is taking the lead because the king is a 7-year-old kid, right? The king is currently a 7-year-old kid. The priest is acting in his proxy in a way. He's not really supposed to. This is not intrinsic to his role, right? This is really the king should be doing that. The king, I've mentioned this before, is in charge. The priest is in charge of the true worship, right? The priest is in charge of the temple. The priest is in charge of sacrifices. The priest is in charge of the sanctity of the sanctified space. The king was to make sure in Israel that that false worship was not permitted. That was his job. The priests were not to go out and drive out all the. And now occasionally they strap swords on too, right? They were all. It reminds me of the Marines, right? I once worked with a guy who was a salesman at the time. He had retired from the Marines, and you would never know it. Like usually when you see a guy that retires from the Marines after 25 years, you're like, you were in the Marines, weren't you? This guy? Not like that at all, man. And he was, did not have that feel at all. And I asked him one day, I'm like, Dave, I'm not trying to offend you here, but I'm trying to understand, how did you survive the Marine Corps with that big smile on your face after 25 years? So, well, I was just a quartermaster, Josh, but every Marine is a rifleman, so don't forget. That's how he said it, right? With a smile on his face. He was a salesman. He just sold light bulbs, man, but he was a rifleman first still for that day, right? You get that feel, right? Anyway, so Jehoiada made this covenant. They went out. All the people of the land went, right, to the house of Baal. Community involvement. Don't you love it? Such a depth of community. Go and strike down the Baal worship in your country. It has to be done that way, by the way. I won't go any further down that road, but I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that if I'm not Catholic, right? I'm not anti-Catholic, but if the Catholics decide they need to drive the Muslims back out of Spain again, I'm Catholic enough to join with them the fight. If they decide that it needs to be done in the United States, I can at least we can cooperate, right? I'm Catholic enough for that. It has to be done. This one we have our chief resident Muslim in Congress telling us all that we hate people and destroy people. Can you imagine a Muslim saying that to Christians, right? That you're spewing hate. Like, aren't you the same religion as Hamas? I mean, like, what do you? I mean, anyway, we've talked about that. I don't care about religion per se, but many of the world's religions are in fact seditious by nature, and Islam is one of them. And sedition is not allowed in Congress, even though they'll claim that there's no religious test for elected office in the United States. That was meant to keep Anglicans from not voting in Catholics and Catholics not for voting in Anglicans. It wasn't for any wacko, whack job, nutcase religion out there to be able to take elected office, right? It wasn't. So anyway, hermeneutics are important when you read the Constitution, right, as well. Just about anything. People who can't read the Constitution can't read anything, and you wonder why political liberals can't read the Bible or the Constitution. It's because they can't read any book. They have no idea how what they're reading, the meaning of what they're reading is determined. They think it was not defined by the author, it's defined by how they feel about it, and that's a load of crap. Don't approach anything that way. In other words, when evil people write books, you should believe them. You should believe them, that they're evil people writing evil things in their evil book, like the Quran. Right? Okay. So, anyway, this is a reasonable response to the presence of dense Baal worship among the people of God. All the people go out and tore down the Baal, house of Baal, altars, his images, they broke in pieces, killed Batan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. You file that under, you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. Right? Standing in the middle of the people of God as a priest of Baal. You should know that that has a shelf life. And the priest appointed officers over the house of Yahweh. And he took the captains of hundreds and the Kerites and the guards and all the people of the land. And they brought the king down from the house of Yahweh and came by the way of the gate of the guards to the king's house. And he sat on the throne of kings. So all the people of the land rioted and burned down the city. Oh, sorry. They rejoiced and the city was quiet. Because they were at peace, right? And that is a righteous state to be in when God's ruler is ruling righteously. And Baal worship has been driven out. They're at peace, and the city was quiet, for they had put Athaliah to death with the sword at the king's house. And Jehoash was 7 years old when he became king. That may be the youngest. Well, Josiah was 8, right? He was 8. Was there anybody younger than 7? Nope. No, I think you have to get into other, like Western civilization before they started, considering anointing babies, and then just letting regents rule and that kind of thing. But 7 is pretty young. 7 is pretty young. So in the 7th year of Jehu is the king in the northern kingdom, right? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, dear. You got to stick that arm up there, honey. You're not that tall.
Who are the Kerites?
I don't know. Who are they? Yeah, I believe that they're the followers of Karen. I don't know. Anybody know who the Kerites are? There's lots of ites lost to history. Mercenaries? So they were followers of Karen. I see. No, I'm just playing. All right. No. I'm just playing. Well, it starts with a C. Karen starts with a C. It's her one salvation among the social media rampage against all the Karens in the world is that they all spell it with a K. So you can say you're excluded from the group. Yeah, mercenary. So, that may be something that might help you with your study Bible, but don't take it as gospel, right? There are so many ites listed in Scripture that we have no idea really who they are. So I didn't focus on that, but apparently mercenaries. And then you have trouble because sometimes they call, is it the Midianites? Midianites became a colloquialism for bad dudes on camels. You know what I mean? Like if you were a bad dude on a camel, if you're a desperado in Israel, running around on a camel, causing havoc, killing people, and taking their stuff, they called you a Midianite. Poor Uncle Midian, I mean, that would be like similar to Corinth. Corinthian became a verb for sexual immorality. Like, change the name of your city, man. And then they named a city in Texas Corinth. Did you know that? So I have a friend who lives in Corinth. Oh, you got to move out of there. They probably Corinthiazami there. You know what I mean? You need to back up. I many years ago, before I came to El Paso Bible Church, I refused to apply to a church, First Baptist of Corinth. I just can't stand up and say that I'm the pastor of First Baptist of Corinth. Anyway, there's no way I'm taking that job. Don't offer it to me. You can't pay me enough to stand up.
Complete rebel now.
Yeah. Corinth, the Corinth is certainly. Yeah, and that's something that one thing y'all know. I don't really care for modern church planning strategy or even church renewal strategy because they all look the same. But the chief paperback writer at Dallas Seminary, who taught, and I won't tell you his name, you can probably find out because he's written about 40 paperbacks that just have different covers on them. Mostly, they mostly say the same thing. But he did say the reason that we need to keep planting churches is because most of the churches that we read about in Scripture, like the foundational ones that got Pauline letters, failed. We need to understand the dynamic. Even the ones planted by an apostle, shepherded by an apostle, taught by an apostle, are rebuked in John's lifetime and told that they won't survive if they don't do this, and then they didn't. So we do need to understand that apostasy, even in the sense of simply losing one's first love, brings churches to a conclusion. The local churches are not guaranteed a lifespan. They're simply guaranteed a conditional lifespan based on their faithfulness, which also applies to our current day, by the way. There are two levels of apostasy that will bring cursing on a church. One is nicely called supersessionism. I've started calling it Christian anti-Semitism, which is simply what it is. I'm not saying they're not going to heaven when they die, but their lampstand is in real danger in terms of revelation, in my opinion. And that's the vast majority of people calling themselves Christians are apostates in this world. That's just simply how it is. But Bill?
Yeah, I was just going to say that in Revelation we see clearly what John saw concerning the churches.
Mm-hmm. Right, and whether, there's a lot of discussion as to whether those are meant to be, I'm going to say the word trans, and y'all are going off. Trans-dispensary, are they predictions of how the church ages are going to go, or are there churches in every age that are analogous to each one of those? I tend to think it's kind of both. I mean, there were historical churches that actually had these problems, and we're supposed to take from that within the first century of Christianity, we already had Galatianism. We already had those churches in Revelation. We already had those things. It is a constant vigilance that is required to maintain a faithful church. Two things: Christian anti-Semitism and faith alone in Christ alone for justification. And when you abandon those two things, you have no claim for God's continued blessing in this world. One based on the Abrahamic blessing, right? Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. But also the distinctiveness of Christianity is based entirely on Jesus, faith alone in Christ alone. Stupid things that you're going to think I'm really anal retentive, really fussy about, or when somebody's stupid billboard says, we love God and we love people. And when I see that, I don't know if you're an English-speaking Muslim or a Christian church, or you could be a synagogue. I mean, whatever. When you say we love God and we love people, that is not the distinctiveness of Christianity. If you want to be distinctively Christian, it's very simple. We love Jesus and we love people. Because the line is, we love because he first loved us. Not talking about your understanding of God the Father or some kind of Unitarian ideal of who God is, that he's an idea, a force, or whatever, but it is the person of Jesus Christ is the pattern of love. And that is the distinctiveness of Christianity. So it's even more insane that people are spending $2,000 a month for a billboard that says something that any Muslim could say. It's bad stewardship at minimum. I mean, but it probably is incipient apostasy. Anyway, soapbox. Did I need to stand on a soapbox? Y'all can see me pretty well. Anyway, but off my soapbox for a minute. So, what's that? I was gonna say I'd probably more distinctive if I kneeled down on a knee, and y'all be like, "Where'd Josh go?" Anyway, so in the 7th year of King Jehoash became king, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba. Jehoash did right in the sight of Yahweh all his days, in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. Very close relationship between the priesthood and the monarchy. Only the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on those high places. Wasn't able to eradicate it entirely. right? And but however, this is something you ought to note. No king does that. Virtually no judge did it. Virtually no king eliminates all, even though it's his obligation. See, that's the booger in the law. You weren't supposed to allow that, right? The king was not supposed to permit that at all, and it still existed. It still carried on. People still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So, why is that relevant? The progress of Scripture, the progress of revelation, we call it technically, demonstrates the necessity of the Messiah, but it also eliminates many, many candidates from consideration. Moses can't be considered. He prophesied that he would be replaced. Joshua serves as close to a king without a monarch as you possibly can, but he doesn't eradicate the land and make it righteous. He certainly doesn't give people a new heart, right? New covenant language or whatever. And so the absolute fulfillment of messianic prophecy is what is required by Scripture's own record. Does that make sense? So when God requires that of the king of Israel in order for the full blessing to come in, that gives us a pattern for understanding prophecy, right? That God expects, God predicts that every last detail, what Jesus refers to as every jot and tittle, will be fulfilled. And you can read each and every prophecy that God has an intermediate purpose for a righteous king, that it brings intermediate blessing. But none of them should be considered as the Messiah, right? And each and every prophecy is fulfilled. Becky, you look like you have a comment.
Yeah. Who Hezekiah took down the high places.
Right.
And I think it's kind of interesting because they were on the verge of being disciplined badly
because
by
of
God.
it. Right.
And
right.
it's like
and
God gave them a period of rest.
A short period. Yep. Yep.
Period.
And even then, however, I'll just comment that even when you break the high places down, you don't break people's hearts down.
And what did
right.
they do on the high
places? It was a place of worship, and Baal worship took a lot of different forms.
Was it Baal worship on the high places?
Well, they're normally associated with the Asherah and the Baal. The practices, to be honest, most pagan practices eventually look awfully similar. Honestly, and so they did. I think they overlapped a good bit. I don't know that we precisely know. But there were forms of altars. Of course, that like just with the godly worship, the lawful worship of Yahweh, there's a lot of different characters of sacrifices that are accepted, right? That are different things. They bring in grain, they bring in oil, they bring in flowers sometimes. Sometimes it's incense as the sacrifice. Sometimes it's an animal sacrifice. Sometimes it's free will. Sometimes it's prescribed. Sometimes you have an option. Sometimes you don't. Generally speaking, I think that's why there's a recipe for incense. As a small detail, there's a particular recipe for incense, and God, remember when they offered strange fire and the incense recipe was wrong, that was a death sentence. There's supposed to be distinctiveness because that was a large part of it. I think the Asherah, the high places for worship of the Asherah were primarily incense, and you would smell that stink. You ever walked into a room that had incense burned in it 3 weeks ago? Right, the stink, when the stench is in the land, which is a biblical reference, right? Though there's a stench of that worship. I think that was literal. They had a stench that was not the Yahwistic. I'm such a nerd. Yahwistic, you like that word? You know what Yahwistic? Yahweh worship, the adjective form. Yeah, that wasn't the right instance. That's the thing, is that the paganisms of the world all eventually coalesce. Right, they're oddly enough, they worship all sorts of gods and depict them all sorts of different ways, and eventually they're all bloodthirsty, horrible people, individuals, that require human sacrifice of one form or another. Right, even secular humanism is the greatest killer of human sacrifice. Right, the killer of humans in the world right now, I think.
In the Rosh Hashanah tablets, they describe the worship practices that are going on in the high places, and they're always orgiastic.
Yeah.
Induced by alcohol and drugs, cut themselves, all kinds of.
Which sounds very much like the Baal worship we see that Elijah had before him, right? In the combat of sacrifices, right? So that's why I say there's a lot of overlap between pagan practices in ancient Near East. They had there are analogs, right? It was strange to me when you read what the sexual standards were, right? They make the men into eunuchs and the women into prostitutes. Like, it's a total, like, counterfeit, like, inversion of what God asked the people to do: be fruitful and multiply and be faithful. Right? It's it's all that. That's all that it ever is. Yeah, Bill.
The trans movement.
Partly, yeah. What has God decided you're going to be? Well, no. We'll reach our own heights, right? I mean, like, there's all sorts of reverberations of the Tower of Babel. There's
Mutilation as well.
Yep, right. Yep, and there's enough testimony about people who have, they call it detransitioning. Isn't that a stupid term? There's only so far you can detransition. Any woodworker knows this. You can cut it off, but you can't always put it back on. You know what I mean? So how are you going to detransition? You didn't transition in the first place. You mutilated, and everybody knows that mutilation isn't able to be fixed. See his little finger here? I'm just waiting for Jesus to make it straight again. This one too. Actually, all of them except my thumb on my left hand are a little crooked. Yeah, right. Yeah. Anyway, but never once did I think, how I'm going to fix that crooked finger? It doesn't work very well. Oh, we'll lop it off. Nah. Nope. And there's a lot of my hobbies. I spent most of my childhood and some measure of my adulthood in a wood shop, and I have 10 fingers. Notice that. See, the Lord has preserved me from the fate of many of my peers. Anyway, so they did. And they still sacrifice and they burn the incense. And I think that's the key. They're sacrificing and burning incense. What are they sacrificing? We're not sure. We can tell, though, that pagan practices were brutal. PETA would have an absolute field day with the way that they strangled animals and spilled their blood slowly and those sorts of things. It was a horrible thing to do. Whereas, the law requires relatively humane sacrifices, even though today, so for example, like in the UK, they thought to do better than kosher or halal requirements, right? And so they decided they use these humane methods, right? And instead of cutting the throat, like both halal and kosher requirements are, which is instantaneous brain death. You've just starved the brain of any activity. They start zapping them with electricity, and they start doing all sorts of horrible things because they're trying to be humane. And it's all about the aesthetics. So when you do that to an animal, the body thrashes, the brain is dead. When you shock an animal, the body is dead, but the brain is alive. It's exactly reverse what they're trying to do, but it's because of the sensibilities of the people watching it who are ignorant. So you understand that the Mosaic law was minimal standard of righteousness, but it was far superior to the things that the people around them did, and it was intended to be that way, to be distinctive. Which is why when God said, this is why it was so abhorrent, and God said that if you do the things that people did before you, that I drove out before you, like I sent bees after them to chase them out of the land. Those are literally can you imagine? God weaponizing bees to drive out the Canaanites. And he says that it was so abhorrent what they were doing that God would even drive out his own people temporarily for doing those things, for making eunuchs out of people that weren't born that way, for prostituting their daughters, for worshiping with the wrong recipe of incense in the wrong location, right? Of contaminating the land. Because we've talked about that too. The reason God determined a location to be worshiped appears to me to be so that you wouldn't constantly be defiled every time you planted something, right? Doesn't that happen a lot in our culture? When I was a kid, it was like the big thing. Oh, they accidentally trying to put a bridge over an Indian burial mound. Well, no one knew that it was a burial mound. It's just a piece of dirt. I mean, like they would say in Lonesome Dove, it's just a boneyard mostly, but it looks pretty in the sunlight. Like there's bones everywhere. If somebody died or got buried somewhere, if everywhere somebody dies is a sacred space, then you can't live. There's no ability to function in the world. And God seems to be preserving the promised land for productivity and abundance for the people who are faithful, to live in the houses they didn't build, to harvest from fields they didn't plant, from vineyards they didn't grow. and not make everything into a potential worship site so that you constantly are making people upset at you by growing grapes on granddaddy's grave or their church or their high place or whatever. God said, break those down because the land is sanctified by the people's sanctified purpose in it. Does that make sense? It's not supposed to be sanctified to all these deities and false worship. Anyway, so he left. He did right in the sight of Yahweh all his days. My point in all of that was, if we can go back to the messianic strategy, the Messiah will not tolerate this. When the fullness of the blessing has come to the people, it will be absolute. And so when I say in Matthew, you can prove that the kingdom did not come because there are things that are unrighteous in the world. And if you can find one thing that is not ruled righteously in the world, the kingdom is not present. And everyone's like, you just one? Their minds are racing, thinking of all the things they've experienced this last week that were unjust just at the DMV. Not to mention, the White House, Congress, Russia, Ukraine, Hamas. I mean, all of the many, many things. But you can point out to one thing: if you were treated unjustly at the tax assessor's office, guess what? You're not in the kingdom. Because the kingdom doesn't engage in fanciful accounting like the El Paso County Central Appraisal District. Right? I mean, little things, relatively speaking, right? When we got World War III on the horizon, we shouldn't probably be complaining about our house values. But, it's still evidence. All right? We got 3 or 4 minutes. But we did get into 12, Danny. See, I told you we were going to do it. So then Jehoash said to the priests, all the money of the sacred things which is brought in the house of Yahweh in current money, both the money of each man's assessment and all the money which any man's heart prompts him to bring into the house of Yahweh, let the priests take it for themselves, each from his acquaintance. In other words, don't let your friends off the hook. And they shall repair the damage of the house, wherever any damage may be found. So go ahead and collect the money in current money. Did y'all ever go to Mexico when they had 2 kinds of pesos? That was not so easy, was it? It's hard enough to figure out what the exchange rate is at any given moment, or if S-Mart is giving you your change back, right? But when you got to lop 2 or 3 zeros off the money, you're like, I'm not that good at math. He wants current money, right? You want to know the value of the thing. It needs to be recently minted. Isn't it nice? We're probably going to end up having to lop zeros off the dollar, right? Yeah. Now your $100 bill is what a $1 bill used to be when I was 5, right? At least it feels that way. 100 is at least the new 20, all right? So, current money, bring us the good stuff. Let's do it. But, verse 6, it came about in the 23rd year of King Jehoash, right? The priests had not repaired the damages of the house. So then King Jehoash called for Jehoiada the priest and for the other priests and said to them, why do you not repair the damages of the house? Now, therefore, take no more money from your acquaintances, but pay it for the damages of the house. So the priests agreed they would take no more money from the people, nor repair the damages of the house. Wait a second. That was not what the king said, is it? So don't take any more money and repair the house. And the priests agreed, we're not going to do that. But Jehoiada the priest took a chest and bored a hole in its lid and put it beside the altar on the right side as one comes into the house of the Lord. And the priests who guarded the threshold put in it all the money which was brought into the house of Yahweh. In other words, they didn't go out panhandling for it anymore. They didn't take it from their friend. There was a system. When they saw that there was much money in the chest, the king's scribe and the high priest came up and tied it in bags and counted the money which was found in the house of Yahweh. They gave the money which was weighed out into the hands of those who did the work, who had the oversight of the house of Yahweh, and they paid it out to the carpenters and the builders who worked on the house of Yahweh, and to the masons and the stone cutters, and for buying timber and hewn stone to repair the damages to the house of Yahweh, and for all that was laid out for the house to repair it. Now I want you to compare that, right? Do you remember when Solomon built the temple? You remember we're talking about you're probably not going to remember because you're not a woodworking nerd like me. What did it say about when Solomon built the temple? How did they do it? How quiet was the construction site? That's what I'm getting at. It says that they pre-fitted it so that there was not the sound of a hammer, a saw, or an axe when they built the temple on the site. Not even noise pollution on the sanctified site. It doesn't sound like how they fixed it. How they had to fix it. It wasn't quite that good. that time, right? And we have the degradation, right, of the temple. You remember that when many centuries later they go into exile, they come back, and eventually they get their crap together and actually get the temple built, right? They lay the foundation stones and it sits there for a long time, and finally, is it Haggai that says, hey, Haggai and a couple others, you brought the money for this, why isn't it built? Same sort of problem. And they cry because it looks like a shack compared to Solomon's temple. There's this degradation of human effort at preserving faithfulness, right, in the cultic sphere. Using cultic in the academic sense, not the occult, right, but cultic religious practice. So when it's up to the people, the worship of Yahweh declines in its majesty, right? See that? We call it, what did we call the temple during Jesus's time? Herod's temple. Why do we call it Herod's temple? Did Herod build it?
No, but he enlarged it.
All of a sudden, in history, it's known as Herod's temple instead of the house of Yahweh, huh? Right? And he's an Idumean, as I recall, right? He's not even Jewish. He's just ingratiating himself to doing that when the people were commanded to preserve that site and to preserve its condition. At least they're doing that here. Finally pulling teeth to get it done. Anyway, we'll stop there. I think we got through enough. Any questions, comments, observations? He ends up, we'll talk about this last week, he ends up making a fairly large error, and then the next thing we read is, and then he died. This guy. So we'll talk about that, right? Because people they get weird when you talk about things like out of 1 John 5. And you talk about the sin that leads to death. And most theological traditions take that to be that you went to hell instead of your heart stopped beating. But there are so many evidences of sin that leads to physical death in Scripture that I like to make sure that we point those out. Because by the time you get to 1 John 5, it should be no surprise at all that you read that there's a sin that leads to death. And I'd say that you do not pray for that. I do not say to pray for that one, because that's done. That's an unpardonable sin category. It is not forgivable. The consequences are absolute. All right, so we'll talk about that next time. But any questions, comments, observations about communism, Calvinism, or the Bible? That's what I started with, so I figure I'd let y'all give your 2 cents. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. We do thank you for your word. We thank you for the faithfulness of the faithful kings. We thank you that this young man who was anointed king at the age of 7 was discipled so closely by a faithful priest and did what was right in the sight of Yahweh because of it. That he